when Pastor Benjamin White discovered Timothy Roberts' skeletal remains trapped beneath the altar of St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in Woodland, Maine, he uncovered the most shocking murder conspiracy in the town's history. A 12-year-old choir boy killed in 1979 by his own pastor and a wealthy businessman to silence his knowledge of massive church fund embezzlement. His body hidden for 24 years in the very basement where he had once knelt in prayer, until a routine maintenance job revealed not only his bones, but a journal documenting his final terrifying hours and the financial corruption that cost him his life, leading to a federal investigation that would expose decades of institutional cover-up, bring down powerful men who thought they were untouchable, and prove that even the most carefully buried secrets cannot escape the hand of divine justice, when one determined minister refuses to let a child's murder remain hidden behind sacred walls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th, 2003, began like countless others at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in Woodland, Maine. Pastor Benjamin White stood at the kitchen window of the rectory, watching the first autumn leaves drift across the church parking lot as he sipped his coffee. The 40-year-old building showed its age in small ways, a loose shingle here, paint beginning to peel there, but it possessed the timeless dignity that drew him to accept this position 6 months ago. Benjamin had arrived in Woodland after completing his seminary training, eager to serve his first congregation. The search committee had been honest about the challenges he would face. St. Margaret's had struggled with declining membership, financial difficulties, and the lingering shadow of tragedy that had haunted the community for nearly a quarter century. Pastor White, Harold Gibbs, knocked on the rectory door, his weathered face creased with concern. The 62-year-old maintenance supervisor had worked at St. Margaret's for over 30 years, maintaining the building with the devotion of someone who saw his work as sacred calling rather than mere employment. "Good morning, Harold. What brings you by so early?" "We've got a problem in the sanctuary, Pastor. That loose floorboard behind the altar we talked about last week, it's gotten worse. I'm afraid someone might trip during Sunday service." Benjamin set down his coffee cup and reached for his jacket. "Let's take a look." The two men walked across the small parking lot, separating the rectory from the main church building. The morning air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of wood smoke from chimneys beginning their seasonal duty. Woodland's population of 3,000 souls made it small enough that everyone knew their neighbors, yet large enough to support several churches, a modest downtown, and the lumber mill that had sustained the community for generations. Inside the sanctuary, morning light filtered through stained glass windows depicting scenes from Christ's ministry. The windows had been donated in the 1950s by families whose names were etched in brass plaques below each panel. Benjamin paused, as he often did, to admire the craftsmanship and remember the faith that had inspired such generosity. "Right here." "Pastor," Harold pointed to an area behind the ornate wooden altar. "This section's been creaking for months, but yesterday I noticed it's actually starting to separate." Benjamin knelt beside the maintenance supervisor, examining the floorboards. The wood was old but well maintained, polished by decades of careful attention. However, one section did indeed show signs of movement. "It's probably just settling," Benjamin suggested. "These old buildings shift with the seasons." "Maybe, but I'd feel better if we reinforced it before Sunday. I've got some tools in the basement, if you don't mind helping me pull up this section." The two men retrieved Harold's toolbox from the church basement, a space that housed the furnace, storage rooms, and a small meeting area used by various church groups. As they worked to carefully remove the loose floorboards, Benjamin found himself thinking about the memorial service scheduled for that afternoon. Every October 15th for the past 24 years, St. Margaret's had held a memorial service for Timothy Roberts. The 12-year-old choir boy had vanished on this date in 1979, disappearing without explanation or trace. Benjamin had learned about Timothy from Margaret Miller, the 78-year-old church organist who had been Timothy's mentor and remained devastated by his loss. "Harold, you were here when Timothy Roberts disappeared, weren't you?" The maintenance supervisor paused in his work, a shadow crossing his face. "I was. Terrible thing. That boy had the voice of an angel and a heart to match, always helping. With set up for services, staying after to practice hymns with Mrs. Miller. What do you think happened to him?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, focusing intently on prying up the loose board. "Police said he probably wandered into the woods and got lost. Lots of wilderness around here, easy for a child to become. Who turned around, but what? Timothy wasn't the type to wander off without telling someone. He was responsible, always checked in with his parents, and he knew these woods better than most adults." Harold lifted the board completely, setting it aside. "Something about the whole situation never sat right with me." Beneath the removed floorboard, they discovered something unexpected. Instead of the solid subflooring Benjamin had anticipated, there was a gap leading to what appeared to be a small cavity. "That's odd," Harold muttered, shining his flashlight into the opening. "This area should be solid foundation." Benjamin peered into the space, noting that it seemed deliberately constructed rather than accidental. Could this be some kind of storage area? Maybe the original builders included space for church records or valuables? "I've been maintaining this building for 30 years, Pastor. I've never seen any documentation about hidden storage spaces." Harold's voice carried a note of unease. "And look at this. The edges of this opening have been sealed recently. See how the wood putty is lighter than the surrounding boards? This was opened and closed again, probably multiple times." The two men examined the cavity more carefully. It was approximately 3 feet square and appeared to extend deeper than their flashlight could illuminate. A musty odor rose from the opening, carrying hints of age and decay that seemed different from the normal basement smells of the old building. "Should we call someone?" Benjamin asked. "The diocese, or maybe the historical society?" "Let me get a better light," Harold suggested. "Maybe we can see what's down there before we involve anyone else." Harold returned with a more powerful lantern, which revealed that the cavity was deeper than either man had suspected. The space appeared to be carved from the bedrock beneath the church foundation, extending back toward the rear wall of the building. "Pastor, look at this." Harold's voice was tight with concern. He directed the light towards something that caught its beam near the back of the cavity. Benjamin looked more closely and felt his breath catch. Partially visible in the shadows was what appeared to be a piece of fabric, old and discolored, but clearly artificial rather than natural debris. "Harold, I think we need to stop here and call the police." "The police? Pastor, it's probably just old construction materials, maybe some rags left by workers decades ago." But Benjamin was remembering his conversation with Margaret Miller about Timothy Roberts. The boy had been wearing his choir robe when he disappeared, she had told him, a white cotton garment with blue trim that had never been found despite extensive searches. "Harold, what color were the choir robes when Timothy was here?" The maintenance supervisor's face went pale as he understood the implication. "White with blue trim, same as we use now." Benjamin pulled out his cell phone, his hands slightly unsteady as he dialed the Woodland Police Department. The morning that had begun with routine maintenance was about to become something far more significant. "Woodland Police, this is Officer Puck. This is Pastor Benjamin White at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church. I need to report the discovery of what might be human remains." There was a brief pause. "Did you say human remains, Pastor?" "We found a hidden cavity beneath the church floor. There are old fabric items that might be connected to the Timothy Roberts case from 1979. Don't disturb anything else, Pastor. We'll Have officers there within 10 minutes. As Benjamin ended the call, he looked at Harold, who was staring into the cavity with an expression of profound sadness. 24 years, Harold whispered. If Timothy's been here all this time. Benjamin placed a comforting hand on the older man's shoulder. We don't know anything yet. Let's wait for the police and let them handle this properly. But even as he spoke the words, Benjamin felt a certainty settling in his chest. The memorial service scheduled for that afternoon would take on a meaning none of them had anticipated. After 24 years of wondering, searching, and grieving, the mystery of Timothy Roberts was about to be solved. The sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the quiet streets of Woodland, growing louder as they drew near to St. Margaret's Church. Whatever lay hidden in the cavity beneath the altar was about to be brought into the light, and Benjamin suspected that nothing in their small community would ever be quite the same again. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, rattling the windows of the sanctuary, as if the building itself was preparing to give up secrets it had held for far too long. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at St. Margaret's with Deputy Sarah Mitchell, their patrol cars pulling into the church parking lot as curious neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk. Word traveled fast in a town of 3,000, and the sight of police vehicles at the church on the anniversary of Timothy Roberts' disappearance sent ripples of anticipation through the community. Pastor White. Sheriff Bradley stepped out of his cruiser, adjusting his uniform hat against the autumn wind. The 52-year-old lawman had served Woodland for over 2 decades, though he'd been a rookie patrol officer when Timothy first vanished. Officer Park radioed that you found something related to the Roberts case. We discovered a hidden cavity beneath the altar floor during routine maintenance, Benjamin explained, leading the officers toward the church entrance. There are fabric items inside that match the description of Timothy's choir robe. Deputy Mitchell, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, pulled out her notebook. Has anyone else been down there? Any contamination of potential evidence? Harold Gibbs shook his head firmly. Just looked with a flashlight. Didn't touch anything once we saw the fabric. Inside the sanctuary, the officers examined the opening with professional attention. Sheriff Bradley crouched beside the cavity, directing his flashlight beam systematically across the space. What they saw made his jaw tighten with grim recognition. Sarah, call the state crime lab. Tell them we need a forensic team immediately. He looked up at Benjamin. Pastor, I'm going to have to ask you to clear the building. This is now a crime scene. A crime scene? Harold's voice cracked. So you think... I think we've found Timothy Roberts, Bradley said quietly, and based on the condition of what I can see down there, this wasn't an accident. Within an hour, St. Margaret's had been cordoned off with yellow tape. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the state forensic examiner, arrived with her team to begin the delicate process of excavating the cavity. Word had spread throughout Woodland, and a crowd of onlookers pressed against the police barriers, their faces mixing curiosity with dread. Eleanor and Frank Roberts, now in their late 60s, stood at the edge of the crowd holding hands. Timothy's parents had aged visibly during the years of uncertainty, their hair white and faces lined with the particular strain that comes from never knowing what happened to a child. Mrs. Roberts, Benjamin approached them carefully. I'm Pastor White, the new minister here. I'm so sorry this is happening on such a difficult day. Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed, but determined. Pastor, if our Timothy is truly in there, we need to know. 24 years of wondering has been its own kind of hell. Frank nodded slowly. Better to know the truth, whatever it is, than to keep living with questions. Dr. Reeves emerged from the church after 3 hours of careful excavation, her expression grave as she approached Sheriff Bradley. The crowd fell silent, straining to hear her words. "We have skeletal remains consistent with a 12-year-old male," she announced. "Preliminary examination suggests the individual died approximately 20 to 25 years ago. We also recovered several personal items, including fabric consistent with choir vestments, a small leather journal, and what appears to be a wooden cross." A collective gasp rose from the gathered crowd. Eleanor Roberts swayed against her husband, who wrapped his arms around her as she began to cry. Margaret Miller, the church organist, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "It's him," Margaret whispered. "After all these years, it's really him." Sheriff Bradley raised his voice to address the crowd. "We cannot make official identification until proper forensic analysis is complete. However, I want to assure everyone that this investigation will be thorough and comprehensive." Sheriff called out George Castellanos from his position near the diner owner's pickup truck. "How did a child end up buried beneath the church altar? That doesn't happen by accident." "We're treating this as a homicide investigation," Bradley confirmed. "Anyone with information about Timothy Roberts' disappearance, no matter how insignificant it might seem, needs to contact the sheriff's department immediately." Dr. Reeves approached Benjamin privately as the crowd began to disperse. "Pastor, the journal we recovered appears to be in remarkable condition. The cavity created an environment that preserved organic materials quite well. Would you be willing to assist with identifying handwriting samples?" "Of course. Margaret Miller might be helpful too. She worked closely with Timothy on his studies." "There's something else." Dr. Reeves lowered her voice. "The positioning of the remains suggests this wasn't a burial. The child was placed in the cavity while still alive." Benjamin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Alive? The skeletal positioning indicates he was sitting upright when death occurred. Combined with the journal and the fact that the cavity was deliberately sealed, this suggests he was trapped rather than killed elsewhere and moved. The implications of this revelation hit Benjamin like a physical blow. Timothy hadn't just been murdered. He'd been entombed alive beneath the very altar where he'd sung hymns and taken communion. As evening approached, Detective Thomas Ryan pulled into the church parking lot. The 68-year-old had officially retired 3 years earlier, but Sheriff Bradley had called him personally. Thomas had been the lead investigator on Timothy's disappearance and knew the case better than anyone. "Tom, thank you for coming," Bradley greeted his former colleague. "I know this brings back difficult memories." Thomas Ryan's face was etched with lines that spoke of decades in law enforcement, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. "I've thought about Timothy Roberts every week for 24 years. If we finally have answers, I want to be part of getting them." Inside the church, now lit by portable floodlights brought by the forensic team, Thomas examined the cavity with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent his career reading crime scenes. "This wasn't random," he concluded after several minutes. "Whoever did this had intimate knowledge of the church building. They knew about structural spaces that wouldn't be discovered during normal maintenance." Someone with access, Benjamin realized. Someone trusted. Exactly. And the timing, October 15th, was a Sunday in 1979. Timothy would have been here for evening choir practice. Someone he trusted convinced him to come down here, then sealed him in. Deputy Mitchell, who had been documenting the scene, looked up from her camera. "Detective Ryan, in your original investigation, did you consider any suspects with this level of building access?" Thomas's expression darkened. "The investigation was limited. We focused on the theory that Timothy had wandered into the woods and become lost. The idea that he might have been murdered here, in the church itself, seemed unthinkable." "Who was serving as pastor in 1979, Benjamin asked. "Father David Turner." He'd been here about 4 years when Timothy disappeared. Highly respected man, well connected in the community. Sheriff Bradley made a note. Is Father Turner still alive? Last I heard, he was living at Sacred Heart Retirement Home. He must be in his 70s now. Dr. Reeves approached with a sealed evidence bag containing the leather journal. I've done a preliminary examination of this. It's definitely written by a child, and many of the entries are dated from October 1979. The final entry is dated October 15th, the day he disappeared, Thomas murmured. What does it say? I can only make out portions, some pages are damaged, but there are references to wrong numbers and Mr. Vincent's money. The final entry mentions being scared and trying to tell Father Turner about something he discovered. Benjamin felt pieces clicking into place. Vincent? Would that be Vincent Blackwell? Sheriff Bradley looked up sharply. The construction company owner. He's been a major contractor in this area for decades. His company did renovation work on several churches in the late 1970s, Thomas confirmed, including St. Margaret's. They built the new basement meeting rooms and updated the foundation, which would have given them detailed knowledge of the building's structure, Deputy Mitchell observed. Dr. Reeves continued reading from the journal. There's an entry here about Timothy finding papers in Father Turner's office that showed different numbers than what Mama and Papa gave for the building fund. He writes about wanting to ask Father Turner about it. The sanctuary fell quiet as the implications sank in. Timothy had discovered financial irregularities involving the church building fund and the construction company. He'd approached his trusted pastor for an explanation, not realizing he was walking into mortal danger. We need to examine all financial records from that period, Sheriff Bradley decided, and I want to speak with both Father Turner and Vincent Blackwell first thing tomorrow. As the investigation team began packing their equipment for the night, Benjamin stood alone in the sanctuary where Timothy Roberts had spent his final moments. The boy had died not from wandering into dangerous wilderness, but from stumbling onto dangerous secrets. He'd been killed not by strangers, but by men he'd trusted with his spiritual guidance and community leadership. Margaret Miller approached him quietly, her face pale but resolute. Pastor White, there's something I need to tell you about the night Timothy disappeared. Something I've never told anyone because I wasn't sure it mattered. What is it, Margaret? I saw Father Turner's car in the parking lot very late that Sunday night after everyone should have gone home. I thought it was strange, but I assumed he'd forgotten something in his office. She paused, wrapping her coat tighter against the evening chill. When I drove past again an hour later, Vincent Blackwell's truck was parked right beside it. Benjamin felt the final piece of the puzzle sliding into place. Tomorrow would bring confrontations with powerful men who had thought their secret was buried forever. But tonight, Timothy Roberts was finally coming home to the light, and his killer's long immunity was about to end. Sacred Heart Retirement Home sat on a hill overlooking Woodlands downtown, its brick facade and manicured gardens presenting an image of peaceful twilight years. Sheriff Bradley and Detective Ryan walked through the automatic doors at 9 o'clock sharp, their footsteps echoing in the polished hallways that smelled of antiseptic and old roses. Father Turner receives very few visitors these days, explained Nancy Price, the facility's administrator, as she led them toward the residential wing. His health has declined significantly in recent months, mild dementia, though he has periods of clarity. They found Father David Turner in the common room, a frail 72-year-old man sitting in a wheelchair by the window. His once commanding presence had diminished to a shadow, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to work a crossword puzzle. The man who had once led St. Margaret's congregation now seemed barely present in his own body. Father Turner, Sheriff Bradley approached. Carefully, I'm Sheriff Tom Bradley, and this is Detective Ryan. We'd like to ask you some questions about your time at St. Margaret's Church. Turner looked up with watery blue eyes that struggled to focus. St. Margaret's? I served there for many years. Beautiful congregation. Are you parishioners? Detective Ryan pulled up a chair, noting how Turner's demeanor seemed to shift between confusion and lucid awareness. Father, we're investigating the disappearance of Timothy Roberts in 1979. Do you remember Timothy? A shadow passed across Turner's face, and for a moment his eyes sharpened with unmistakable recognition. Timothy, such a bright boy, wonderful voice. His parents were so proud. What happened to Timothy, Father? Bradley asked gently. Turner's hands began to shake more noticeably, and he looked down at his crossword puzzle. I don't. The woods around here can be dangerous for children. So easy to get lost. Father Turner, Ryan leaned forward. We found Timothy yesterday. He was buried beneath the altar at St. Margaret's. The elderly priest's face went completely white, and his crossword puzzle slipped from his trembling fingers to the floor. No, that's not. He went home. I told him to go home. You told him to go home? When did you tell him that? Turner's breathing became labored, and he pressed a hand to his chest. I can't. My heart isn't strong. The doctor says I shouldn't get upset. Bradley exchanged glances with Ryan. Turner's reaction was telling, but the man's fragile condition made aggressive questioning impossible. They would need a different approach. Meanwhile, across town at Blackwell Construction Company headquarters, Deputy Mitchell was having her own confrontation. Vincent Blackwell's office occupied the top floor of a modern building that overlooked the lumber mill, its walls decorated with photographs of major construction projects throughout northern Maine. This is about something that happened over 20 years ago. Blackwell, now 65 but still imposing at 6 feet tall, sat behind his mahogany desk with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. I'm afraid my memory isn't what it used to be. Your memory seems fine when it comes to business details, Mitchell observed, gesturing toward the wall of awards and project photographs. Surely you remember the St. Margaret's renovation in 1979. We've done work on dozens of churches over the years. Churches, schools, municipal buildings. It's what we do. Mitchell consulted her notes. According to diocesan records, Blackwell Construction was paid $347,000 for foundation work and basement renovations at St. Margaret's. That was a substantial project for 1979. Blackwell's expression remained neutral, but Mitchell noticed his fingers drumming silently on the desk. If that's what the records show, then I'm sure it's accurate. The interesting thing is, we can't find detailed invoices for that work. Just lump sum payments authorized by Father Turner. That seems unusual for such a large project. Father Turner was an efficient administrator. He preferred to keep paperwork simple. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. Mr. Blackwell, where were you on the evening of October 15th, 1979? 24 years ago. Deputy, I can barely remember where I was last Tuesday night. According to a witness, your truck was seen in the St. Margaret's parking lot late that evening, parked next to Father Turner's car. For the first time, Blackwell's composure wavered slightly. A witness? After all these years? Memories can be unreliable, especially when people want to see something that fits their theories. Back at Sacred Heart Retirement Home, Detective Ryan was trying a gentler approach with Father Turner. Father, I understand this is difficult, but Timothy's parents deserve to know what happened to their son. Turner looked out the window toward the town below, his voice becoming barely audible. Vincent said it would be simple, just a small adjustment to the invoices. No one would notice, and the church would still get everything it needed. Vincent Blackwell? He was very persuasive, said the church deserved quality work, but the diocese was being unrealistic about costs. If we inflated some line items, we could cover the real expenses and have something extra for future projects. Ryan kept his voice gentle. What was the something extra for, Father? Turner's eyes filled with tears. My sister needed surgery. Experimental treatment not covered by insurance. Vincent offered to help if I cooperated with the billing adjustments. And Timothy found out about this arrangement. Turner nodded slowly, his shoulders beginning to shake with suppressed sobs. He was helping organize old files for Margaret, found copies of the original estimates and the final invoices. Bright, boy good with numbers. He noticed the discrepancies immediately. What did Timothy do when he found the discrepancies? He came to me after choir practice that Sunday evening, asked innocent questions about the construction costs, wanted to understand why the numbers were different. I tried to explain it away, but he was too smart. Ryan waited patiently as Turner composed himself enough to continue. Timothy said he was going to ask his father about it. Frank Roberts was on the building committee, had donated significantly to the construction fund. Timothy thought maybe there was just some confusion he could help clear up, but you couldn't let him do that. Turner's voice broke completely. Vincent was in my office when Timothy came back. The boy had gotten suspicious when I couldn't explain things properly. He'd gone home and looked at his father's copy of the building fund documentation. Detective Ryan felt his stomach tighten. Timothy came back that night? He knocked on my office door around 8 o'clock. Said he'd compared the numbers and knew something was wrong. He was going to tell his parents and the building committee unless we could explain the differences. What did Vincent Blackwell do? Turner was crying openly now, his frail body shaking with the weight of 24 years of buried guilt. Vincent, in panicked, said we couldn't let a child destroy everything we'd worked for. I tried to calm him down, but Vincent grabbed Timothy. Where did this happen? In my office. Timothy tried to run, but Vincent caught him. I begged Vincent to just talk to the boy, explain that grown-up business was complicated, but Vincent said Timothy was too smart, would never accept excuses. Ryan's training kept his voice steady, despite his growing horror. What happened next? Father? Vincent said we needed time to think, to figure out how to handle the situation. He forced Timothy down to the basement, to that little space behind the foundation where they'd been working. Said we'd keep him there overnight while we decided what to do. But you didn't let him out. Turner's confession came in broken whispers. I went home, told myself Vincent would release him in the morning after we'd figured out how to explain everything. But when I came back Monday morning, Vincent was sealing up the opening. Said Timothy that he'd gotten sick during the night. Ryan had to take a deep breath before asking his next question. Father Turner, was Timothy alive when Vincent sealed that opening? The elderly priest's silence stretched for nearly a minute before he nodded almost imperceptibly. Vincent said it was too late to help him, that if we called for medical attention, everything would come out anyway. He convinced me that Timothy was going to die regardless, and calling for help would just destroy more lives. The confession that Detective Ryan had just heard represented one of the most callous murders in Maine's criminal history. A 12-year-old boy had been deliberately entombed alive to protect a financial fraud scheme, left to die slowly in darkness beneath the very altar where he'd worshipped. Meanwhile, at Blackwell Construction, Deputy Mitchell was preparing to end her interview when Vincent Blackwell made a crucial mistake. Deputy, I hope you understand that I've always been a pillar of this community. My company has provided hundreds of jobs, built essential infrastructure. Sometimes people make accusations when they're looking for someone to blame for old tragedies. Mr. Blackwell, I haven't accused you of anything. I've simply asked about your whereabouts on a specific night 24 years ago. Blackwell's His face flushed as he realized his error. I assumed that's where this was leading. What was leading? All I've mentioned is that your truck was seen at the church. Look, if someone thinks they saw me there, they're mistaken. I had no reason to be at St. Margaret's that late at night. Mitchell stood up, closing her notebook. Mr. Blackwell, I think we'll be continuing this conversation down at the sheriff's department. Officially. As both interrogations concluded, the scope of Timothy Roberts' murder was becoming clear. What had begun as a simple financial fraud had escalated to child murder when an innocent boy stumbled onto evidence of embezzlement. Two men who held positions of trust and authority in Woodland had chosen to preserve their reputations and freedom. By entombing a child alive beneath the house of God, the investigation was far from over, but the truth was finally emerging from 24 years of darkness. The Woodland Police Department had never processed an arrest of this magnitude. Vincent Blackwell sat in the interrogation room's metal chair, his expensive suit wrinkled from the restraints, while Sheriff Bradley and Detective Ryan reviewed the mounting evidence through the one-way glass. The construction magnate's attorney, Charles Whitman, had arrived within an hour of the arrest, transforming what had been a cooperative interview into a hostile standoff. My client has been a respected member of this community for over 40 years, Whitman declared, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he spread legal documents across the metal table. These accusations are based on the confused ramblings of a senile priest and 24-year-old memories that couldn't possibly be reliable. Bradley entered the room carrying a thick file folder. Mr. Blackwell, we've been reviewing financial records from the St. Margaret's renovation project. Some interesting discrepancies have emerged. All construction projects involve complex billing, Blackwell replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. I'm sure any apparent irregularities can be explained by standard industry practices. Detective Ryan opened the folder, revealing photocopied invoices and bank records. Standard practice doesn't typically involve billing for materials that were never delivered or work that was never performed. According to diocesan records, Bradley continued, St. Margaret's paid your company for extensive foundation reinforcement work. However, structural engineers who examined the building yesterday found no evidence of the specified improvements. Whitman leaned forward. Sheriff, construction techniques from 1979 were different from today's standards. The absence of visible modifications doesn't prove work wasn't performed. Perhaps not, Ryan agreed, but this might. He placed a bank deposit slip on the table. This shows a $50,000 cash deposit to your personal account 3 days after the final church payment was processed. That's unusual for business transactions. Blackwell's composure finally cracked slightly. I'm not required to explain every personal financial transaction to you. You are when that transaction is connected to a child's murder, Bradley said, flatly. In another part of the building, Pastor Benjamin White was meeting with FBI agent Thomas Rodriguez, who had driven up from Portland after learning about the case. The federal involvement wasn't unexpected. Crimes involving religious institutions and financial fraud often crossed state lines and required federal expertise. Pastor White, I understand you've been cooperative throughout this investigation, Rodriguez said, settling into a chair across from Benjamin in the department's small conference room. We appreciate that, and we need your continued assistance. Of course, anything I can do to help bring justice for Timothy. Rodriguez opened his briefcase and removed several documents. We've been analyzing the financial records from multiple churches in northern Maine during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Blackwell Construction worked on at least 6 different projects during that period, all involving similar billing irregularities. Benjamin felt a chill of realization. You think there were other victims? We think Timothy Roberts discovered a fraud scheme that was much larger than anyone realized. If Blackwell and Turner were willing to kill a child to protect their secret, The stakes must have been enormous. Have you found evidence of other churches being defrauded? Rodriguez nodded grimly. St. Paul's in Caribou, Holy Trinity in Bar Harbor, Sacred Heart in Bangor, all show the same pattern. Inflated invoices, vague work descriptions, and payments that don't match the actual improvements made to the buildings. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate, over $2 million across all the projects. In 1979 dollars, that was enough to buy several houses or start multiple businesses. Benjamin stared out the conference room window towards St. Margaret's, where crime scene tape still fluttered in the afternoon breeze. Timothy died because he stumbled onto something much bigger than a single church renovation. Meanwhile, in the main lobby, Eleanor and Frank Roberts sat with their son Andrew, who had driven up from Boston after hearing about the discovery. Dr. Andrew Roberts, now 45, carried the bearing of a successful physician, but his eyes held the same haunted quality as his parents, the look of people who had lived with unanswered questions for too long. "Mom, Dad, you don't have to stay here," Andrew said quietly. "Let the police handle this. Come back to Boston with me for a few days." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "We've waited 24 years to know what happened to Timothy. We're not leaving now. The reporters are already gathering outside," Frank observed, watching through the lobby windows as news vans from Portland and Bangor television stations set up their equipment. "This is going to become a circus." Margaret Miller pushed through the front doors, her face flushed with exertion and determination. The elderly organist had walked the 6 blocks from her apartment despite her arthritis, refusing to let anyone else drive her to the police station. "Eleanor, Frank," she called out, hurrying toward them. "I came as soon as I heard about the arrests." "They arrested Father Turner too?" Andrew asked. Margaret nodded, settling into a chair with obvious relief to be off her feet. "Saw them taking him out of Sacred Heart in a wheelchair about an hour ago. Poor man looked like he'd aged 10 years since yesterday." "Margaret," Eleanor said carefully, "all these years, did you ever suspect anything?" The organist was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folding and unfolding in her lap. "I knew something wasn't right about Timothy's disappearance. That boy would never have wandered off without telling someone, but I never imagined—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "None of us could have imagined this," Frank said bitterly. "We trusted these men. Turner baptized Timothy, confirmed him, heard his confessions. Blackwell built half the buildings in this town. Back in the interrogation room, Vincent Blackwell's attorney was attempting damage control as the evidence mounted against his client. Sheriff Bradley, my client is willing to discuss a plea arrangement regarding the financial irregularities," Whitman announced. "However, any suggestion that he was involved in Timothy Roberts' death is completely unfounded." "Mr. Whitman," Detective Ryan replied, "your client's truck was positively identified in the church parking lot the night Timothy disappeared. Father Turner has provided detailed testimony about what happened that evening. The testimony of a man with diagnosed dementia is hardly reliable evidence." Bradley leaned across the table. "Mr. Blackwell, Father Turner described specific details that only someone present that night would know. He knew about Timothy's return to the church with his father's building fund documents. He knew about the argument in the office. He knew about the decision to hide Timothy in the basement." Blackwell finally spoke, his voice lower and more strained than before. "Whatever Turner told you, he's trying to save himself by blaming everything on me. So you admit you were at the church that night?" Blackwell caught himself glancing at his attorney. "I'm not admitting anything." "Vincent," Ryan said, dropping formality, "you've been successful in this community for decades. You've employed hundreds of people, supported local charities, been a leader. Help us understand how it came to this." For the first time since his arrest, Blackwell seemed to consider telling the truth. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked older than his 65 years. Turner came to me with the idea, he said quietly, ignoring his attorney's sharp intake of breath, said the diocese was being unrealistic about renovation costs, that churches deserved quality work, even if it meant creative billing. And you agreed. At first it seemed harmless, a little padding on material costs, charging for upgrades that could be done later. The churches got good work, we made a fair profit, everyone was happy. But it grew beyond that. Blackwell nodded slowly. Turner's sister needed expensive medical treatment. I had cash flow problems from other projects. What started as small adjustments became larger. And Timothy threatened to expose everything. Blackwell's face hardened. Again, that boy was going to destroy dozens of families. My company employed 60 people at the time. Turner supported his sick sister and aging parents. One curious child was going to bring down everything we'd built. So you decided he had to die. I decided he had to be stopped. Blackwell corrected. I never intended for him to die. The plan was to keep him overnight, figure out how to handle the situation. Detective Ryan felt disgust rising in his throat. You sealed a 12-year-old boy in a hole and left him to suffocate. That's not stopping him. That's murder. Blackwell's attorney grabbed his arm. Vincent, don't say another word. But 24 years of carrying the secret had finally broken something in Vincent Blackwell. He was already weak when I sealed the opening, crying, having trouble breathing. I told myself he wouldn't last long anyway. The confession that followed would ensure Vincent Blackwell spent the rest of his life in prison. As Sheriff Bradley concluded the interview, the full scope of Timothy Roberts' murder was finally clear. A bright, innocent boy had died because he possessed the moral courage to question adults who had betrayed their positions of trust. Outside the police station, the October sun was setting over woodland, casting long shadows across the town that had finally learned the truth about its darkest secret, the discovery of Timothy's. Journal entries sent shockwaves through the investigation that reached far beyond Woodland's borders. Dr. Patricia Reeves worked through the night at the State Crime Laboratory, carefully separating pages that had fused together over 24 years, using specialized techniques to preserve the boy's final written words. Each entry revealed another layer of the conspiracy that had cost him his life. FBI agent Rodriguez returned to Woodland at dawn with a team of federal financial investigators. Their overnight analysis of bank records had uncovered a network of fraudulent transactions that spanned 3 decades and involved prominent figures throughout northern Maine's religious and business communities. Pastor White, Rodriguez found Benjamin in the church rectory, where he'd spent a sleepless night grappling with the horror that had unfolded beneath his altar. We need to discuss some additional findings that have emerged from Timothy's journal. Benjamin poured coffee for both men, his hands steady despite the emotional turmoil of the past 48 hours. What did Timothy write about in those final hours? Rodriguez opened a folder containing photocopied journal pages, the child's, careful handwriting preserved forever as evidence of corruption and murder. Timothy was methodical in documenting what he'd discovered. He didn't just find discrepancies in the St. Margaret's renovation. He'd been comparing financial records from multiple churches where his father had served on building committees. Frank Roberts served on other church committees, Timothy writes, about visiting other parishes with his father, helping organize fundraising records. The boy had an exceptional mind for numbers and noticed patterns that adults missed or chose to ignore. Benjamin studied the photocopied pages, noting Timothy's neat penmanship and careful documentation. Even facing mortal danger, the 12-year-old had continued gathering evidence like a seasoned investigator. This entry from October 12th mentions meetings between Father Turner and important men from the diocese. Rodriguez pointed out, Timothy describes hiding in the church office supply closet and overhearing conversations about adjusting records before the audit. There was a diocesan audit scheduled. Every 3 years, the diocese conducts financial reviews of parish operations. The 1979 audit was scheduled for November, just weeks after Timothy's disappearance. Benjamin felt the implications settling over him like a cold weight. Timothy's murder wasn't just about protecting one fraudulent project. It was about preventing a full diocesan investigation. Rodriguez nodded grimly. We believe Timothy's death allowed the fraud to continue for several more years before anyone noticed the patterns. Meanwhile, at Sacred Heart Retirement Home, Father David Turner lay in the medical wing under police guard. The stress of his confession had triggered a mild heart attack, and his physician, Dr. Jennifer Adams, was monitoring his condition while psychologist Dr. Susan Taylor attempted to help him process decades of suppressed guilt. Father Turner, Dr. Taylor spoke gently. I understand you're experiencing significant emotional distress, but it's important for Timothy's family that we understand everything that happened. Turner's voice was barely audible, weakened by both physical illness and emotional exhaustion. I've carried this sin for 24 years. Every Mass I celebrated, every sermon I preached, every time I offered comfort to grieving families, Timothy's face was there, watching me. Tell me about the night he died. Timothy came back to the church around 8:30 that Sunday evening. I was in my office with Vincent discussing how to handle the upcoming audit. The boy knocked on the door, said he needed to speak with me privately about something important. Dr. Taylor made notes as Turner continued his painful recollection. Timothy had his father's building fund records with him, along with some papers he'd found in my filing cabinet. He'd matched the original estimates with the final invoices and discovered the discrepancies. How did Timothy gain access to your files? Margaret Miller had asked him to help organize old records for storage. Timothy was always helpful, always eager to assist with church business. He had access to the office and apparently used that in time to examine financial documents. What was Vincent Blackwell's reaction when Timothy presented his findings? Turner's breathing became more labored as he recalled the confrontation. Vincent panicked immediately, grabbed Timothy by the shoulders, demanded to know who else he'd told about the discrepancies. The boy was frightened but stood his ground, said he'd only talked to his father about finding the papers. Did Timothy threaten to expose the fraud? He wasn't threatening anyone. Timothy thought there had been some mistake, wanted to help fix whatever error had occurred. He trusted us completely. Turner's voice broke. That child came to us for guidance, and we destroyed him for it. At the Woodland Police Department, Detective Ryan was reviewing additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of the conspiracy. Thomas Merrill, the former church treasurer who had worked with Father Turner during the renovation period, had been located and was providing testimony that corroborated Timothy's journal entries. I knew something wasn't right about the Blackwell invoices, Merrill admitted, his 69-year-old frame bent with the weight of long-carried knowledge. But Father Turner assured me that construction billing was complex and that questioning Vincent Blackwell's methods would insult a major church benefactor. Did you ever see the original estimates for comparison? Father Turner kept all construction documents in a locked file in his office, said he preferred to handle the details personally to avoid burdening the building committee with technical matters. Sheriff Bradley leaned forward. Mr. Merrill, in your opinion, were the other building committee members aware of the fraud? Absolutely not. Frank Roberts, Carl Henderson, the other members, they trusted Father Turner completely. When he presented invoices for approval, no one questioned the amounts because they assumed he'd verified everything. Meanwhile, at Blackwell construction headquarters, FBI agents were executing a search warrant that revealed the full scope of the fraudulent operation. Company records dating back to 1975 showed systematic overbilling across dozens of projects, with particular focus on religious institutions whose leaders were less likely to question invoicing practices. Agent Rodriguez supervised the evidence collection, noting how meticulously Blackwell had maintained records of his illegal activities. "Look at this," he called to his colleagues, indicating a ledger book hidden in an office safe. Blackwell kept detailed records of every fraudulent transaction, including notes about which church officials were cooperative and which asked too many questions. The ledger revealed that Father Turner hadn't been Blackwell's only clerical accomplice. Several other priests and ministers had received financial incentives to approve inflated invoices, creating a network of corruption that infected religious institutions throughout the region. In the afternoon, Mayor Richard Foster called an emergency town meeting at Woodland Elementary School's gymnasium. Word of the arrests and the FBI investigation had spread throughout the community, creating an atmosphere of shock and betrayal that demanded public address. "Citizens of Woodland," Mayor Foster began, facing a crowd of nearly 800 people packed into the gymnasium. "We're gathered tonight to address the tragic discoveries at St. Margaret's Church and their implications for our community." The crowd murmured with nervous energy as Foster continued. "The investigation has revealed that Timothy Roberts was murdered in 1979 by individuals who held positions of trust and authority in our town. This is not just a crime against one family, it's a betrayal of everything we believe about our community." Eleanor Roberts stood up in the front row, her voice carrying clearly across the gymnasium. "My family wants everyone to know that we don't blame this community for what happened to Timothy. Evil men made evil choices, but this town has supported us through 24 years of uncertainty." Frank Roberts joined his wife. "Timothy loved Woodland, loved St. Margaret's, loved the people here. We won't let his killer's actions poison our feelings toward the place where our son was happiest." Pastor Benjamin White had been asked to address the gathering, and he rose with the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. "The question everyone's asking is how this could have happened in our church, in our community. The answer is that evil often hides behind masks of respectability and authority. But we also need to ask ourselves what we can do to ensure this never happens. Again, how do we create accountability? How do we protect the innocent? How do we honor Timothy's memory by building something better from this tragedy?" The community meeting lasted 3 hours, with residents expressing anger, grief, and determination to prevent future corruption. Several people volunteered to serve on a new oversight committee for church finances, while others proposed memorial projects to honor Timothy's memory. As the meeting concluded, Margaret Miller approached the Roberts family with tears in her eyes. "Eleanor Frank, I want you to know that Timothy's favorite hymn was 'How Great Thou Art.' Every time we sang it, his voice would soar above all the others. I'd like to organize a memorial concert in his honor, featuring that hymn and others he loved." "Timothy would like that very much," Eleanor replied, embracing the elderly organist who had been her son's mentor and friend. Outside the gymnasium, the October night was crisp and clear, with stars visible above the small town that was beginning. The long process of healing from its darkest chapter. The truth about Timothy Roberts was finally emerging, but the work of justice was far from complete. The third day of the investigation brought unexpected complications as word of the Timothy Roberts case reached state and national media outlets. By sunrise, Woodland's main street was crowded with satellite trucks from CNN, NBC, and other major networks, transforming the quiet Maine town into the center of a media storm that threatened to overshadow the pursuit of justice. Sheriff Bradley found himself fielding calls from reporters across the country, all seeking exclusive details about what they were calling the altar murder. The sensational nature of the case, a child killed beneath a church altar by trusted religious figures, captured public attention in ways that made Bradley deeply uncomfortable. Pastor White, Bradley called the rectory early that morning. "We need to discuss media management. This investigation is becoming a circus, and I'm concerned it might compromise our ability to gather evidence and conduct interviews." Benjamin stood at his kitchen window, watching news crews set up equipment. In the church parking lot, "Sheriff, I'm more concerned about the Roberts family's privacy. They've suffered enough without becoming tabloid entertainment." "Agreed. I've instructed all officers to refer media inquiries to the State Police Public Information Office. But I wanted to warn you, reporters are asking specifically about you and your role in discovering Timothy's remains." An hour later, that warning proved prophetic when Janet Cross, a reporter from the Portland Herald, knocked on the rectory door. The 41-year-old journalist had covered crime stories throughout Maine for over a decade and possessed the persistent professionalism that made her both effective and occasionally intrusive. "Pastor White, I'm Janet Cross from the Herald. I'd like to speak with you about your discovery of Timothy Roberts and what it means for the community's faith." Benjamin opened the door but remained in the doorway. "Ms. Cross, I appreciate your interest, but this investigation is ongoing. I can't discuss details that might compromise the legal proceedings. I understand your position, but the public has a right to know how something this horrific could remain hidden for 24 years. Are there systemic problems in church oversight that allowed this to happen?" The question struck at the heart of Benjamin's own struggles since the discovery. "Miss Cross, evil exists in the world, and sometimes it infiltrates institutions we trust. But that doesn't mean all religious organizations are corrupt or that faith itself is invalid. What about the financial fraud aspect? Sources suggest this case involves millions of dollars embezzled from churches across Maine. Shouldn't parishioners be concerned about how their donations are managed?" Before Benjamin could respond, Margaret Miller approached from across the parking lot, walking with determination despite her arthritis. The elderly organist had clearly decided to confront the media presence herself. "Young lady," Margaret addressed Janet Cross with the authority of someone who had taught Sunday school for 50 years, "this community is grieving. We've learned that a child we loved was murdered by men we trusted. Your questions can wait until after we've buried Timothy properly." Cross turned her attention to Margaret. "Mrs. Miller, you worked closely with Timothy Roberts. Did you ever suspect that Father Turner might be capable of harming a child?" Margaret's face flushed with anger. "Father Turner was a weak man who made terrible choices, but he wasn't a monster. Vincent Blackwell was the monster. Turner was just too cowardly to stop him." "Are you saying the church bears some responsibility for not recognizing the danger?" "I'm saying you're asking the wrong questions," Margaret replied sharply. "Instead of trying to blame institutions, why don't you ask how we can honor Timothy's memory and prevent this from happening again?" Meanwhile, at the courthouse in nearby Ellsworth, preliminary hearings were being scheduled for Vincent Blackwell and Father David Turner. Judge Catherine Walsh, a 56-year-old jurist known for her careful attention to legal procedure, was reviewing the evidence to determine whether sufficient probable cause existed for murder charges. Attorney Benjamin Cross, the prosecutor, assigned to the case, was building what he believed would be one of the strongest murder cases in Maine legal history. The combination of Timothy's journal, Father Turner's confession, physical evidence, and Blackwell's admissions created a comprehensive case that would be difficult for any defense attorney to challenge. "Your Honor," Cross addressed Judge Walsh during the preliminary hearing, "the evidence clearly shows premeditated murder committed in the course of concealing financial crimes. Both defendants participated in actions that directly caused Timothy Roberts' death. Charles Whitman, Blackwell's defense attorney, attempted to minimize his client's culpability. Your Honor, while my client acknowledges poor judgment regarding financial matters, the evidence doesn't support premeditated murder charges. This was a situation that escalated beyond anyone's intentions. Judge Walsh examined the evidence carefully. Before ruling, based on the testimony and physical evidence presented, I find sufficient probable cause to bind both defendants over for trial on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud. Back in Woodland, the Roberts family was struggling with the intense media attention surrounding their son's case. Dr. Andrew Roberts had taken leave from his medical practice to help his parents navigate the overwhelming interest from reporters, book agents, and television producers seeking to tell Timothy's story. "Mom, Dad," Andrew said as they sat in their living room on Elm Street, curtains drawn against the cameras positioned across the street, "we need to make some decisions about how to handle this attention." Eleanor looked exhausted from 3 days of constant stress. "I just want to bury my son and grieve in peace, but everyone wants to interview us, wants to know how we feel about the men who killed Timothy." Frank was more blunt in his assessment. "I don't want to make money off Timothy's death. These people offering book deals and movie rights, they don't care about our son. They just see a sensational story." "What if we could use the attention to help other families?" Andrew suggested. "Maybe establish a foundation for missing children or push for better oversight of church finances." Eleanor considered this possibility. "Timothy always wanted to help people. Maybe some good could come from this tragedy if we handle it right." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Pastor Benjamin White stood on their porch, holding a small, wrapped package. "I hope I'm not intruding," Benjamin said, as Frank invited him inside. "I wanted to give you something we found among Timothy's possessions." Eleanor carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a wooden cross, hand-carved with intricate detail. The craftsmanship was clearly the work of a child, but the devotion evident in every careful cut spoke to the deep faith that had sustained Timothy even in his final hours. "Timothy made this?" she asked, tears beginning to fall. According to his journal, he carved it during the hours he was trapped. The final entry mentions wanting to leave something beautiful for his parents to remember him by. Frank took the cross with trembling hands, running his fingers over the smooth wood that his son had shaped with love during his last moments of life. He was still thinking of us. Even then, he was still thinking of us. The discovery of the hand-carved cross provided a poignant counterpoint to the media circus surrounding the case. While reporters focused on the sensational aspects of corruption and murder, Timothy's final creation spoke to the faith and love that had defined his short life. That evening, Bishop William Thornfield arrived in Woodland to address the crisis within his diocese. The 58-year-old bishop had served in Maine for over a decade and understood that the Timothy Roberts case represented the most serious challenge to Catholic authority in the region's history. Pastor White, Bishop Thornfield met with Benjamin at St. Margaret's, now reopened after the forensic team completed their work. "I want to personally apologize for the failures of oversight that allowed this tragedy to occur. Bishop, the important thing now is ensuring justice for Timothy and preventing future incidents." "Agreed. I'm implementing immediate changes to financial oversight procedures for all parishes in the diocese. No single person will have sole authority over construction contracts or major expenditures." "What about Father Turner? Will he face church discipline in addition to criminal charges?" Bishop Thornfield's expression was grave. "Father Turner will be defrocked immediately. His actions represent the most serious violation of sacred trust imaginable." As the day ended, Woodland began to settle into a new reality where its most trusted figures had been revealed as killers and thieves. The community's faith had been shaken, but not destroyed, and the process of healing was beginning even as the pursuit of justice continued. The carved wooden cross that Timothy had created, in his final hours, stood on the Roberts family mantle, a testament to the power of faith to endure even in the darkest circumstances. While his killers awaited trial, Timothy's legacy was already inspiring changes that would protect other children and restore accountability to institutions that had betrayed their sacred trust. 2 weeks after the discovery, the forensic analysis of St. Margaret's basement revealed additional evidence that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. Dr. Patricia Reeves had returned with a specialized team to conduct a comprehensive examination of the cavity where Timothy had died, using techniques that weren't available during the original 1979 investigation. Pastor White, Dr. Reeves called Benjamin to observe as her team worked in the basement. "We found scratch marks on the interior walls of the cavity that confirmed Timothy was alive and conscious when he was sealed inside." Benjamin felt his stomach turn as he examined the evidence. Tiny fingernail scratches in the stone walls told the story of a terrified child's desperate attempts to escape his tomb. How long would he have survived? Based on the cavity's size and ventilation, probably 12 to 18 hours. The scratches are concentrated near the sealed opening, suggesting he spent his final hours trying to claw his way out. The forensic team had also discovered remnants of the wooden boards that Blackwell had used to seal the opening. Tool marks on the wood-matched implements found in Blackwell's construction equipment, providing physical evidence linking him directly to Timothy's entombment. Meanwhile, attorney Benjamin Cross was preparing for what would become the most significant murder trial in Maine's recent history. The prosecutor had assembled a team of specialists to handle the complex case involving child murder, financial fraud, and institutional corruption. The defense will argue that Timothy's death was accidental, Cross explained to FBI agent Rodriguez during a strategy meeting. They'll claim Blackwell and Turner intended only to temporarily detain the boy while they figured out how to handle the situation. How do we counter that argument? With Timothy's journal and the physical evidence, the boy documented his fear and his attempts to call for help. The scratch marks show he was conscious and fighting for his life. This wasn't an accident, it was deliberate murder. Cross had also discovered that Vincent Blackwell's financial records revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate measures to maintain his fraudulent operation. By 1979, Blackwell Construction was facing bankruptcy, making the church contracts essential to the company's survival. Blackwell had motive beyond just covering up the fraud, Cross continued. Exposure would have meant the end of his business, empire, and personal financial ruin. He killed Timothy to protect millions of dollars in fraudulent income. At Sacred Heart Retirement Home, Father David Turner's health had deteriorated significantly under the weight of his confession and impending trial. Dr. Jennifer Adams was concerned that the elderly priest might not survive long enough to face justice. Father Turner's guilt is literally killing him, Dr. Adams confided to Sheriff Bradley during a medical update. His blood pressure is dangerously elevated, he's not eating, and he's showing signs of severe clinical depression. Doctor, I understand your medical concerns, but this man participated in the murder of a child. The state has an interest in ensuring he's competent to stand trial. I'm not suggesting he should escape justice. I'm warning you that he might die before the trial concludes. Turner's deteriorating condition prompted Prosecutor Cross to expedite his prosecution timeline. If Turner died before testifying against Blackwell, the state would lose its primary witness to the murder itself. In Woodland, the community was adapting to life under constant media scrutiny. Local businesses found themselves dealing with reporters seeking background information about the key figures in the case, while residents grew increasingly protective of the Roberts family's privacy. George Castellanos, owner of the Main Street Diner, had become an unofficial spokesman for the community's frustration with media intrusion. "These reporters don't understand what this town has been through," he told Pastor Benjamin over coffee one morning. "They want sensational quotes about corruption and murder, but they don't want to hear about 24 years of people supporting the Roberts family." How are Eleanor and Frank holding up? Better than I expected, honestly. They've found strength in knowing the truth finally. But Andrew's been dealing with reporters camping outside their house, following them to the grocery store. It's harassment. The Roberts family had indeed made a decision about how to handle the media attention. With the help of Attorney Cross, they had established the Timothy Roberts Foundation for Missing Children, dedicated to improving investigation techniques and supporting families of missing children. "We can't bring Timothy back," Eleanor announced at a press conference held at Woodland Elementary School, "but we can honor his memory by helping other families avoid the uncertainty we've lived with for 24 years. The Foundation's first initiative would be funding advanced forensic training for rural police departments, ensuring that future investigations wouldn't suffer from the resource limitations that had hampered Timothy's case." Meanwhile, FBI agent Rodriguez was uncovering connections between the main church fraud scheme and similar operations in other states. Financial records indicated that Blackwell had consulted with contractors in New Hampshire and Vermont who were involved in comparable billing irregularities. "This wasn't an isolated operation," Rodriguez explained to Pastor Benjamin during an update meeting. "We're finding evidence of systematic fraud targeting religious institutions throughout New England." Blackwell was part of a regional network that specifically exploited the trust relationship between contractors and faith communities. How many other victims might there be? "We've identified at least 40 suspicious projects across 6 states. The total financial damage could exceed $10 million. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Timothy Roberts hadn't just stumbled onto a local fraud scheme. He had discovered a criminal enterprise that had been systematically exploiting religious institutions for decades. Detective Thomas Ryan, despite his official retirement, had become increasingly involved in tracking down the network's connections. His decades of experience and intimate knowledge of the original case made him invaluable to the federal investigation. "Tom," Sheriff Bradley found him at the police station reviewing files late one evening, "you don't have to do this. You've earned your retirement." "I spent 24 years thinking I'd failed that boy," Ryan replied, without looking up from the documents. "Now I have a chance to make sure his death exposes every part of this corruption. I'm not stopping until we've found all of them." Ryan's investigation had identified 3 other children who had gone missing in different states during periods when similar fraud schemes were being exposed. While no direct connections had been proven, the pattern suggested that Timothy might not have been the only child to die protecting these criminal operations. The upcoming trial was generating interest from legal scholars across the country. The combination of child murder, institutional corruption, and federal fraud charges created a case study that would be examined in law schools for years to come. Defense attorney Charles Whitman was struggling to develop a strategy that could save his client from life imprisonment. Blackwell's partial confession had eliminated most avenues for denying involvement, leaving Whitman to focus on minimizing the charges from first-degree murder to manslaughter. "Your Honor," Whitman argued during a pre-trial hearing, "while my client's actions were inexcusable, the evidence doesn't support premeditated murder. This was a situation that escalated beyond anyone's control, resulting in tragic but unintended consequences." Prosecutor Cross countered with Timothy's journal. entries and the physical evidence of his prolonged suffering. Your Honor, Vincent Blackwell made a deliberate decision to seal a conscious child in a stone cavity and leave him to die. The evidence shows Timothy survived for hours, crying out for help that never came. This is the most heinous form of premeditated murder. Judge Walsh was carefully reviewing all pretrial motions to ensure that the eventual trial would focus on facts rather than emotion. The intense media coverage had created a challenge in finding impartial jurors, but the judge was determined to ensure both defendants received fair trials. As November approached, Woodland prepared for the trial that would finally bring justice for Timothy Roberts. The small town had been forever changed by the discovery of corruption and murder within its most trusted institutions. But the community's commitment to truth and accountability had never been stronger. The wooden cross that Timothy had carved during his final hours remained on the Roberts family mantle, a daily reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, faith and love could endure. Soon, the boy's killers would face the justice that had been delayed for 24 years. The trial of Vincent Blackwell and Father David Turner opened on a cold December morning at the Hancock County Courthouse in Ellsworth, despite the winter weather. Hundreds of spectators lined up before dawn, hoping to secure seats in the courtroom gallery. National media coverage had transformed the case into a symbol of institutional corruption and betrayed trust. Judge Catherine Walsh called the court to order as jury selection concluded after 3 challenging weeks. Finding 12 impartial jurors had proven difficult given the extensive media coverage, but the final panel included farmers, teachers, retirees, and small business owners who represented rural Maine's values and skepticism of authority. Prosecutor Benjamin Cross stood to deliver his opening statement, carrying a folder containing Timothy's journal and photographs of the crime scene. The courtroom fell silent as he approached the jury box, understanding that the next few hours would set the tone for one of Maine's most significant murder trials. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Cross began, his voice steady and clear. "This case is about the murder of a 12-year-old boy who trusted the wrong adults. Timothy Roberts died because he possessed the moral courage to question financial irregularities that 2 powerful men were desperate to conceal." Cross methodically outlined the prosecution's case, describing how Timothy had discovered the fraud scheme through his volunteer work organizing church records. He explained the boy's final confrontation with Father Turner and Vincent Blackwell, and the cold calculation that led to Timothy's entombment beneath the altar. The defendants will claim this was an accident, that they never intended to kill Timothy Roberts. But the evidence will show that Vincent Blackwell deliberately sealed a conscious, frightened child in a stone cavity and walked away, knowing full well that the boy would die slowly and alone. Defense attorney Charles Whitman followed with an opening statement that acknowledged his client's poor judgment while attempting to minimize the murder charges. Vincent Blackwell made terrible decisions under extreme pressure, but making bad choices in a crisis doesn't constitute premeditated murder. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Patricia Reeves, who presented the forensic evidence with clinical precision. The jury listened in stunned silence as she described the scratch marks on the cavity walls and explained how Timothy had spent his final hours trying desperately to escape. Based on the positioning of the scratches and the depth of the marks, Dr. Reeves testified, Timothy Roberts was conscious and actively trying to free himself for several hours after being sealed in the cavity. "In your professional opinion," Cross asked, "was Timothy Roberts alive when the opening was sealed?" "Yes, the physical evidence indicates he was conscious, alert, and fighting for his life when Mr. Blackwell closed the cavity entrance." Whitman's Cross-examination attempted to raise doubts about the forensic timeline, but Dr. Reeves's expertise and detailed documentation made her testimony virtually unassailable. The second day of testimony featured Detective Thomas Ryan, whose detailed knowledge of the original investigation provided crucial context for the jury. Ryan explained how the 1979 search had focused on the surrounding wilderness, never considering that Timothy might have been murdered inside the church itself. In 1979, the idea that a child could be killed by his own pastor seemed unthinkable. Ryan testified, "We searched thousands of acres of forest because we believed Timothy had wandered off and become lost." Detective Ryan, Cross continued, did the original investigation consider Vincent Blackwell as a potential suspect? No. Mr. Blackwell was a respected businessman with no criminal record. He had access to the church as a contractor, but that access was considered legitimate. Ryan's testimony revealed how thoroughly the murderers had covered their tracks, exploiting the community's trust to avoid suspicion for nearly a quarter-century. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Margaret Miller took the witness stand. The elderly organist, now 78 and walking with a cane, commanded the courtroom's attention as she described her relationship with Timothy and her memories of the night he disappeared. Timothy was special, Margaret testified, her voice strong despite her age. He had a gift for music and a heart for helping others. When he found those financial papers, he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was trying to help fix what he thought was a mistake. "Mrs. Miller," Cross asked, "please tell the jury what you observed on the night of October 15th, 1979. "I saw Father Turner's car in the church parking lot around 9 o'clock, which seemed late for a Sunday night. When I drove past again an hour later, Vincent Blackwell's truck was parked right beside it." Defense attorney Whitman challenged Margaret's memory, suggesting that 24 years had clouded her recollection. But Margaret's detailed description of both vehicles and her certainty about the timing made her testimony compelling. "Mum, you're asking this jury to believe you remember specific details from nearly a quarter-century ago?" Margaret fixed Whitman with a steely gaze. "Young man, I may be old, but I'm not senile. I remember that night clearly because it was the last time anyone saw Timothy alive." On the third day, Father David Turner was brought from Sacred Heart Retirement Home to testify. The frail 72-year-old required assistance to reach the witness stand, his deteriorated condition shocking many observers who remembered him as a commanding religious figure. "Father Turner," Cross began gently, "please tell the jury what happened when Timothy Roberts returned to the church on October 15th, 1979. Turner's voice was barely audible as he recounted the fatal confrontation. Timothy had discovered the billing discrepancies and wanted to discuss them with me. Vincent was in my office when the boy arrived with his father's records." What was Mr. Blackwell's reaction to Timothy's discoveries? Vincent became agitated. Immediately, he grabbed Timothy by the shoulders and demanded to know who else the boy had told about the financial irregularities. "Did Timothy threaten to expose the fraud?" Turner shook his head weakly. "Timothy wasn't threatening anyone. He thought there had been some bookkeeping error and wanted to help correct it. The boy trusted us completely." Cross guided Turner through the events that followed: Vincent's decision to detain Timothy in the basement, the boy's pleas for release, and the final sealing of the cavity opening. "Father Turner, was Timothy Roberts alive when Mr. Blackwell sealed the opening?" "Yes," Turner whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Timothy was crying and calling for help. Vincent told me the boy would be fine overnight, that we'd figure out how to handle everything in the morning. But you didn't release Timothy the next morning, did you?" "When I arrived Monday morning, Vincent had already sealed the opening permanently. He said Timothy had become ill during the night and that it was too late to help him. Whitman's cross-examination attempted to portray Turner as the primary culprit, suggesting that Blackwell had merely followed the priest's lead. But Turner's testimony consistently implicated both men as equal participants in Timothy's murder. The prosecution concluded its case with testimony from Eleanor and Frank Roberts, who described their son's character and the 24 years of uncertainty that had defined their lives since his disappearance. Timothy was curious about everything, Eleanor testified through tears. He wanted to understand how things worked, why people made certain decisions. If he found something that seemed wrong, he couldn't rest until he understood it. Mrs. Roberts, Cross asked, "How has Timothy's death affected your family? We've lived in limbo for 24 years, never knowing if our son was alive somewhere, suffering, needing help. The not knowing was almost worse than death itself." Frank Roberts spoke about the wooden cross Timothy had carved during his final hours. Even facing death, our son was thinking about others, creating something beautiful to comfort us. That cross reminds us that Timothy's faith never wavered, even when the adults he trusted betrayed him. The defense case lasted only 2 days, with Whitman attempting to portray Blackwell as a fundamentally decent man whose judgment had been clouded by financial pressure and Father Turner's manipulation. Character witnesses described Blackwell's charitable contributions and community involvement, while expert witnesses suggested that Turner's mental state in 1979 might have influenced his decision-making. But the defense couldn't overcome the physical evidence, Timothy's journal entries, and the defendant's own confessions. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple counts of fraud. Judge Walsh scheduled sentencing for the following week, noting that both defendants faced life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As court officers led Blackwell and Turner away in shackles, the packed courtroom remained silent, absorbing the weight of justice finally served after 24 years. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor and Frank Roberts faced a crowd of reporters and supporters. "No verdict can bring Timothy back," Eleanor said, "but knowing that his killers will spend the rest of their lives in prison brings us a measure of peace." Pastor Benjamin White, who had attended every day of the trial, reflected on how the pursuit of truth had ultimately triumphed over institutional corruption. Timothy's death wasn't meaningless if it prevents other children from suffering similar fates. The trial's conclusion marked the end of one chapter in Woodland's healing process, but the work of rebuilding trust and implementing reforms was just beginning. The sentencing hearing took place on a snowy January morning, exactly 3 months after Timothy Roberts's remains had been discovered beneath St. Margaret's altar. Judge Catherine Walsh entered the courtroom carrying the weight of imposing justice for one of Maine's most heinous crimes, while family members, community leaders, and media representatives filled every available seat. Vincent Blackwell, now gaunt and grey after months in custody, showed no emotion as he stood before the bench. Beside him, Father David Turner required assistance from court officers, his deteriorating health making him appear decades older than his 72 years. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Walsh announced, "I will hear victim impact statements from those affected by these crimes." Eleanor Roberts approached the podium with dignity that had sustained her through 24 years of uncertainty and 3 months of reliving her son's murder through trial testimony. Her voice remained steady as she addressed the court and the men who had killed her child. "Timothy was 12 years old when you decided his life was worth less than your money," Eleanor said, looking directly at Blackwell and Turner. "You didn't just kill our son. You stole 24 years of our lives, forcing us to live with questions that had no answers until Pastor White discovered the truth." She paused, gathering strength to continue. Timothy's faith never wavered, even in his final hours. The cross he carved while dying shows the kind of man he would have become. You destroyed that future for 30 pieces of silver, just like Judas betrayed Jesus. Frank Roberts followed his wife to the podium, his hands shaking as he held notes he'd prepared. My son trusted you, Father Turner. He came to you for guidance, believing you would help him understand what he'd discovered. Instead, you delivered him to his murderer. Frank turned his attention to Vincent Blackwell. And you looked into the eyes of a frightened child and decided to bury him alive rather than face the consequences of your theft. There is no punishment severe enough for what you've done. Dr. Andrew Roberts spoke about the brother he'd lost and the family that had been shattered by Timothy's disappearance. My parents aged decades in the months after Timothy vanished. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone was marked by his absence. You didn't just kill a child. You tortured an entire family for nearly a quarter century. Margaret Miller, despite her advanced age, insisted on addressing the court. The elderly organist spoke about Timothy's musical gifts and his eager willingness to help with church activities. That boy had more integrity in his 12 years than these men showed in their entire adult lives, Margaret testified. Timothy died because he couldn't ignore wrongdoing, even when adults told him to mind his own business. His moral courage should be celebrated, not punished with death. Pastor Benjamin White provided a statement on behalf of the broader faith community. These crimes have shaken people's trust in religious institutions, but they've also reminded us why oversight and accountability are essential. Timothy's death must serve as a warning against the corruption that can flourish in darkness. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Walsh asked both defendants if they wished to address the court before sentencing. Father David Turner attempted to stand, but collapsed back into his wheelchair, overcome by emotion and physical frailty. Your Honor, Turner whispered, his voice barely audible throughout the courtroom. I have spent 24 years asking God's forgiveness for my cowardice and complicity. I failed in my most sacred duty to protect the innocent. No punishment you impose can exceed the judgment I face from my Creator. Vincent Blackwell remained seated, his attorney having advised against making any statement that might be used in future civil proceedings. His silence spoke volumes about his continued refusal to accept full responsibility for Timothy's murder. Judge Walsh reviewed the sentencing guidelines and the nature of the crimes before pronouncing judgment. Vincent Blackwell and David Turner, you have been convicted of the premeditated murder of Timothy Roberts, a child whose only crime was possessing the moral courage to question your corruption. This court finds that your crimes represent the most serious breach of trust possible. Adults in positions of authority who murdered a child to protect their financial schemes. The evidence shows that Timothy Roberts suffered for hours before dying, alone and afraid, calling out for help that never came. Vincent Blackwell, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. David Turner, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Both sentences to run consecutively with additional terms for conspiracy and fraud charges. As court officers prepared to escort the defendants away, Father Turner collapsed completely, requiring emergency medical attention. Paramedics worked to stabilize him as the courtroom emptied, his frail body finally succumbing to the weight of justice and guilt. 3 weeks later, the Roberts family gathered at Mount Olive Cemetery for Timothy's funeral, 24 years after his death, but finally able to lay their son to rest with dignity and closure. Pastor Benjamin White conducted the service, while Margaret Miller played Timothy's favorite hymns on a portable organ brought specially for the occasion. Timothy Roberts lived only 12 years, Benjamin said to the hundreds of mourners gathered. despite the bitter cold, but his impact will last far beyond his brief time on earth. His courage in confronting corruption has led to reforms that will protect other children. His faith sustained him even in death, inspiring all of us to hold fast to our beliefs in the darkest times. The wooden cross Timothy had carved during his final hours was buried with him, a symbol of faith that had endured even in the face of ultimate betrayal. Eleanor and Frank Roberts placed white roses on the small casket, finally able to say goodbye to the son they had never stopped loving. In the months that followed, the Timothy Roberts Foundation for Missing Children grew into a significant force for investigative reform and family support. The foundation funded advanced forensic training for police departments throughout rural New England, ensuring that future missing child cases would benefit from techniques unavailable in 1979. The foundation also supported legislation requiring independent oversight of religious institution finances, preventing the kind of unchecked authority that had enabled Turner and Blackwell's fraud scheme. Timothy's death became the catalyst for transparency measures that protected both congregations and their donations. FBI agent Rodriguez's investigation into the regional fraud network ultimately identified 63 separate projects involving billing irregularities worth over $15 million. Prosecutions in 4 states resulted in additional convictions and the recovery of millions in stolen funds that were returned to victimized organizations. St. Margaret's Episcopal Church underwent significant changes under Pastor Benjamin White's leadership. The congregation voted to install a memorial window, depicting Timothy as a young angel, his hands holding the wooden cross he had carved. The window served as a daily reminder of the price of moral courage and the importance of protecting the innocent. The cavity beneath the altar was filled with concrete and blessed by Bishop William Thornfield, who declared it consecrated ground. In Timothy's memory, a small bronze plaque marking the location contained a simple inscription: Timothy Roberts, 1967-1979, faithful unto death. Father David Turner died in prison 6 months after sentencing, his health finally failing under the weight of guilt and age. Vincent Blackwell remained incarcerated at the Maine State Prison, spending his remaining years in solitary reflection on the choices that had cost a child his life. Detective Thomas Ryan returned to full retirement, his final case having brought justice for the boy whose disappearance had haunted him for decades. The veteran investigator often visited Timothy's grave, leaving small carved wooden crosses that honored the child's memory and faith. On October 15, 2004, exactly 1 year after Timothy's remains were discovered, Woodland held its first annual Timothy Roberts Day of Service. Community members volunteered at local charities, schools, and churches, embodying the spirit of helpfulness that had defined the murdered boy's character. The Roberts family found peace in knowing their son's death had led to meaningful changes that would protect other children and families. Eleanor often spoke to church groups about the importance of financial oversight and child protection, ensuring that Timothy's story served as both warning and inspiration. Margaret Miller, now nearing 80, continued playing organ at St. Margaret's until her death at age 84. Her final request was that Timothy's favorite hymn, How Great Thou Art, be played at her funeral, bringing full circle the musical bond between mentor and student that had endured beyond death. Pastor Benjamin White remained at St. Margaret's for another 15 years, building the congregation into one of Maine's most vibrant faith communities. His discovery of Timothy's remains and pursuit of justice established him as a leader who would never tolerate corruption or abuse within religious institutions. The wooden cross that Timothy Roberts carved during his final hours became a symbol of faith, persevering through ultimate darkness. Replicas were distributed to churches throughout New England, reminding congregations that even in the face of betrayal and death, love and faith could endure. Timothy Roberts died at 12 years old, but his legacy lived on in the reforms a courage inspired, the foundation that bore his name, and the countless lives touched by his story of faith triumphant over evil. The boy who had trusted the wrong adults became a guardian angel for future generations, ensuring that his death would prevent other children from suffering similar fates. Justice had finally been served, truth had conquered deception, and a child's faithful heart had transformed tragedy into lasting hope for communities throughout New England and beyond. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.